Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to break down complex sources into clear, actionable insights. Today, we're focusing on, well, a really critical area: the specific health challenges faced by older adults and the nursing strategies needed, straight from a medical surgical nursing perspective.
It's definitely a huge topic. And the demographics, they're shifting fast. Right now, something like 15% of the U.S. population is over 65. But what's really striking is the fastest growing group, the old, those folks between 85 and 99.
Yeah, understanding their specific needs is just non-negotiable, isn't it? And I like how our source material pushes back on lumping all older adults together. It gives us those four subgroups.
Right. The young old, 65 to 74.
Middle old, 75 to 84.
The old, 85 to 99.
And the elite old, 100 plus.
Exactly. Recognizing these distinctions, it really sets the stage for more individualized care. And to tackle this big topic, the chapter really zeroes in on three priority concepts: mobility, nutrition, and cognition.
Mobility, nutrition, cognition. Got it.
Yeah. Pretty much everything we'll discuss today, from medication risks to preventing falls, it loops back to maintaining at least one of those core abilities.
Okay, before we dive deeper, let's maybe nail down some key terms. What exactly are we talking about when we say specific health issues for this group?
Well, first off, we need to understand geriatric syndromes. These are major health problems we often see in late adulthood. But here's the really important part: they are not normal aging. Things like incontinence, falls, confusion, those signal as syndromes, something we need to address, not just brush off as getting older.
That's a powerful distinction. Syndrome versus just aging.
Definitely. We'll also touch on polypharmacy, that's using multiple drugs, maybe getting duplicate prescriptions, high doses, using them too long, it's a big hazard, and relocation stress syndrome. That's the real physical and emotional distress people feel when they move, like from home to hospital or into long-term care.
Okay, that framing helps a lot. Let's start with wellness, thinking about older adults living in the community. What's the biggest hurdle to them staying healthy and independent?
Often, it really boils down to health literacy. If someone can't easily get, understand, or use health information, well, they can't make good decisions. And that leads straight to healthcare disparities, often tied to things like lower income or less education. So, the clinical takeaway: always support their independence. We need to actively make sure they stay in control and are part of every decision about their care.
Makes sense. And the data seems pretty clear on what actually works in practice for maintaining that independence. We can sort of group the key health behaviors, right? Health protecting.
Right, that's your immunizations and safety stuff. The focus shifts, less broad childhood shots, more specific maintenance. So flu shots after October 1st, definitely pneumococcal and shingles vaccines, Tdap every 10 years. And at home, safety means getting rid of hazards, scatter rugs, super waxed floors, things like that. And critically, making sure they use all their meds correctly, prescribed and over the counter.
Okay, and then there's the health enhancing side. That's more lifestyle.
Exactly. The source really highlights cutting back fat intake, less than 30% of calories, and boosting complex carbs and fiber, aiming for, 5 or more servings of fruits and veggies daily, and maybe the most impactful thing: regular exercise, 3 to 5 times a week.
Right, exercise. Which leads us nicely into our second priority concept: nutrition. It's not just about calories, is it? Age changes things.
It really does. Older adults actually need more vitamins D, C, A, and calcium. Why? Because their bodies just aren't as good at storing, using, or absorbing them anymore.
And the risks for poor nutrition, they seem like a mix of physical and social factors.
Absolutely. Their sense of taste and smell might decrease, so they might overuse sugar or salt to compensate. Then you add in potential dental problems, tooth loss, dentures that don't fit well. Lots of medications can affect appetite too. Plus, things like reduced income might mean relying on cheaper, less nutritious food, and loneliness or depression can definitely impact eating habits.
Okay, and when nutrition and hydration aren't adequate, especially with fluid and fiber, we run into a big safety issue: constipation. What's the absolute must-do here?
Yeah, constipation is common, but you can't ignore it. It can lead to pain, even obstruction. The approach needs to be proactive. We're talking 35 to 50 grams of fiber daily. That's quite a bit. At least 2 liters of fluid, unless there's a strong medical reason not to. And importantly, nurses should teach folks about non-drug ways first, like that colon cocktail, prune juice, applesauce, psyllium, before jumping to stimulant laxatives.
I can see how that links right into the other big hydration worry: dehydration. Why are older adults more vulnerable?
Well, a couple of reasons. They just have less total body water to begin with. And crucially, their sense of thirst decreases. They might not feel thirsty even when they need fluids. Plus, they might deliberately drink less, maybe because they worry about having to get up at night, that's nocturia, or they're afraid of falling on the way to the bathroom. That fluid restriction, it's dangerous. Causes dehydration, messes up electrolytes like sodium and potassium. So the guidance is clear. Encourage 2 liters of water daily and limit caffeine and alcohol, which can dehydrate.
Okay, so nutrition fuels the body, but fuel isn't much good if the engine, so to speak, isn't moving well. Let's hit our first priority concept hard, mobility. Why is exercise so critical here?
Honestly, it's probably the closest thing we have to a magic bullet for healthy aging. Regular activity, it decreases fall risk, builds strength, improves sleep, helps manage weight. It also lowers the risk for chronic diseases, think diabetes, heart disease, even dementia. For mobility specifically, walking 30 minutes 3 to 5 times a week is a great baseline. And we absolutely have to emphasize weight-bearing exercise, especially for women, to fight osteoporosis. Plus, resistance training to keep muscle mass.
And mobility ties directly into safety. When that functional ability declines, the data points straight at falls as the biggest threat, right?
Oh, absolutely. Falls are the #1 accident, and we shouldn't think of them as purely accidental. They're often predictable, maybe preventable. You look at the risk factors. Sensory changes, like vision getting worse, especially close-ups, that's presbyopia. Reduced sense of touch, which affects balance, slower reaction time. Then pile on medications, especially things like opioids and benzodiazepines, which can cause dizziness or that drop in blood pressure when standing up, orthostatic hypotension. Older women using these are at particularly high risk.
So interventions need to be systematic. The CDC has an approach.
Yes, the STEADY initiative. It's a solid framework. Screen for risk, assess the factors you can actually change, and then intervene. Interventions mean modifying the home, getting rid of those scatter rugs, putting in handrails, making sure lighting is good. Regular eye exams are key. And there's good evidence for exercises like Tai Chi or yoga. They really help with balance, especially for older women who might have developed phallophobia, that fear of falling.
Okay, outside the home, driving becomes a big safety concern.
It really does. Car crashes are a major cause of injury and death, often linked to those declining functional abilities. Reaction time slows, multitasking gets harder, and sensory changes like presbycusis, age-related hearing loss play a role too. So as nurses, we need to screen for these things, help manage them. That might mean suggesting driver refresher courses, like the ones AARP offers. And sometimes it means referring for a professional on-road assessment, suggesting alternatives like community transport. That's about safety and support, not taking away independence lightly.
Let's circle back to medications, because polypharmacy sounds like one of the highest risk factors we've discussed. Managing dozens of pills feels overwhelming. What's the single most vital thing a nurse can do?
The absolute most critical intervention, it's the medication assessment. Doing it thoroughly, at least every 6 months. The brown bag technique is great for this. Have the patient literally bring in everything they take, every pill, supplement, herb, everything. The core issue is those age-related changes in pharmacokinetics, basically. How the body handles drugs, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, it all changes.
Can you break down those physiological impacts a bit?
Sure. So absorption might change because of increased stomach pH or decreased blood flow. Distribution changes because there's less body water and often less albumin, but more fat tissue, so fat-soluble drugs can hang around longer. Metabolism in the liver slows down. The liver might be smaller, have less blood flow, less enzyme activity. This can lead to higher drug levels in the blood. And excretion, mainly the kidneys. Renal blood flow and the filtration rate decrease. This means slower drug clearance, less creatinine clearance, and a much higher risk of drugs building up to toxic levels.
Wow, okay. So the mantra has to be,
Start low, go slow, always. And we need to collaborate with the prescribers using tools like the Beers criteria. That's the list of medications considered potentially inappropriate for older adults, drugs like piperidine, certain antidepressants like amitriptyline, or even diphenhydramine found in many OTC cold meds.
okay, shifting gears to cognition, our third priority concept. The source is really clear. Significant cognitive decline is not a normal part of aging, but we do encounter the 3Ds: depression, delirium, and dementia.
Right. And depression is actually the most common mental health issue in this group. It can be primary, maybe related to neurotransmitters, or secondary, linked to situational things like loss or dealing with chronic illness. We use screening tools like the Geriatric Depression Scale Short Form, the GDSSF. A score of 10 or more suggests we need to look deeper, possibly clinical depression. And there's a big drug alert here from the sources. Avoid tricyclic antidepressants if possible. They have strong anticholinergic effects like confusion, constipation, urinary retention. SSRIs are generally the first choice.
Now, differentiating dementia from delirium, that seems like a common point of confusion in practice. How do we keep them straight?
It's crucial. Dementia, like Alzheimer's, is typically chronic. It develops slowly, progressively. It's a long-term decline. Delirium, on the other hand, is acute. It has a sudden onset, and its symptoms fluctuate. They can change throughout the day. The key features are inattentiveness, disorganized thinking, and an altered level of consciousness. It can be hyperactive, hypoactive, or mixed. And importantly, delirium is a medical emergency. It signals something serious is wrong and often predicts worse outcomes.
So if you suspect delirium, what are the immediate potential causes a nurse should investigate?
Delirium often has multiple triggers, but key things to look for immediately: drug therapy, especially opioids, anticholinergics, sedatives. Fluid and electrolyte imbalances are huge. And infections. A urinary tract infection, a UTI, is a classic trigger for acute confusion or delirium in an older adult. Sometimes it's the only sign. We use the confusion assessment method, or PREAM, to help diagnose it. It requires that acute onset fluctuating course and inattention, plus either disorganized thinking or an altered level of consciousness. Management means finding and treating that underlying cause, giving oxygen if needed, treating the infection, managing electrolytes, plus supportive things like frequent reorientation, maybe calming music, familiar items from home, or even fidget objects like a doll or stuffed animal for someone who's agitated.
Okay, let's move into our final section, looking at some institutional and social challenges, starting with relocation stress syndrome.
Yeah, it's something we can easily underestimate. Moving someone to a new place, hospital, long-term care, even if it's necessary, can be deeply traumatic. It takes away their sense of control, their familiar environment. The stress shows up in different ways: sleep problems, stomach upset, withdrawal, anxiety, anger, depression. So to minimize it, best practice involves maximizing their input and decisions, explaining everything clearly and repeatedly, bringing in familiar items from home, reorienting them often, and really focusing on building trust quickly. Avoiding unnecessary room changes helps too.
And sadly, we also have to talk about the risk of elder neglect and abuse.
We do. Neglect, just failing to provide basic needs like food, clothing, medication, actually makes up almost half of all reported cases. And often, the abuser is a family member, maybe a caregiver, who's completely overwhelmed and frustrated. Clinically, neglect might show up as pressure injuries, maybe contractures, dehydration, the person just seeming listless. Physical abuse signs could be bruises, especially in clusters of patterns that look non-accidental, burns, maybe unusual hair loss. And the legal side is clear. As healthcare professionals, we are mandated reporters. If we suspect abuse or neglect, we must report it, usually to Adult Protective Services or the state ombudsman.
Now, for older adults who are hospitalized, there's a framework to quickly flag common problems, right? Spices.
Exactly. Spices. Some people call it the geriatric vital signs. It's a great mnemonic to help us quickly assess for 6 common serious conditions that can complicate a hospital stay. S is for sleep disorders. P for problems with eating or feeding. I for incontinence, remembering it's not normal aging. C for confusion, differentiating that acute delirium from chronic dementia. E for evidence of falls. And S for skin breakdown. So using S for sleep, we think about managing pain, light, noise, keeping them awake more during the day. For E, evidence of falls, we'd use a validated scale like the Morse Fall Scale or Hendrick II on admission to gauge risk.
Falls again, they seem unavoidable in the inpatient setting almost. What are the key prevention tactics there?
Well, the biggest predictor is if they've fallen before. Other big risks are advanced age, having multiple illnesses, general weakness, cognitive problems, and certain medications. And a really common scenario is falls related to toileting, often at night because of nocturia and maybe being confused in the dark. So prevention strategies include things like checking on the patient frequently, maybe every 30 to 60 minutes for high-risk individuals, involving family as safety partners, reminding the patient constantly to call for help before getting up, keeping the bed in the lowest position, using bed alarms or low beds for those at highest risk.
Which inevitably brings up the topic of restraints. Always controversial.
Always. And the definition is broad: any device or drug that prevents free movement. Physical restraints like vests or even all 4 side rails up sometimes need a provider's order and are really restricted now by agencies like the Joint Commission. The absolute rule is try alternatives first, always. That means things like reorientation, using validation therapy for dementia, checking frequently, providing diversional activities or music, having someone supervise them closely, scheduled toileting every hour or 2. Chemical restraints using drugs like antipsychotics. Haloperidol is a common one. Anti-anxiety meds, antidepressants, sedatives to control behavior are also heavily scrutinized. Antipsychotics especially shouldn't just be used for anxiety or sedation without a clear psychiatric indication. And if antipsychotics are used, there's another drug alert. Monitor super closely for side effects like those anticholinergic effects again, constipation, dry mouth, urinary issues, orthostatic hypotension, Parkinson-like symptoms, and even high blood sugar.
That was a really thorough walkthrough of some dense material. Thanks. So, to wrap up, if someone listening only remembers 3 core things from this deep dive, what should they be?
Okay, 3 things. First, always frame your clinical thinking around those 3 priority concepts: mobility, nutrition, and cognition. They touch everything. Second, really grasp that geriatric syndromes are complex. They need specialized knowledge. Especially know the difference between acute delirium and chronic dementia. It's critical. And third, regarding medications, because of all those pharmacokinetic changes we talked about, remember the principle. Start low, go slow. Always.
Excellent summary. Mobility, nutrition, cognition. Understand the syndromes, especially delirium versus dementia, and start low, go slow with meds. And maybe one final thought for you, the listener, to chew on as you apply this knowledge. Consider the impact of healthcare disparities. The source material points out that some groups, like Hispanic older adults or elders in the LGBTQ community, often face extra barriers leading to worse health outcomes.
That's such a crucial point because understanding those disparities, achieving cultural competence, that's really the final piece, isn't it? It's what ensures that all this specialized nursing knowledge actually reaches every patient effectively. It directly impacts how well we can help them maintain their nutrition, their mobility, and their cognition. It connects everything.